Today we'll see a new topic called test classes. I'll give a quick introduction about why we have a test class and all, then we'll follow by a SOSLs. So actually why by the naming itself you can see those are also Apex classes, but we use those for a testing purpose. So test of what? Testing a Apex classes only. So we're writing a different Apexes, right? Like it could be a controller of Visual Force page or a batch class or a future methods or schedulable jobs or triggers or any kind of Apex code that we write. So we need to test it. Whether are we writing a right code? Does it execute at any point of time? Do you have scenarios that will execute your code or not? And if, when you execute, do we run into any kind of exceptions or not? All this we need to check again using a code only. Like we'll call those code using a anonymous block, right? Usually, and we'll see it could be a issue or not, or like we if it's a Visual Force page, we'll click all the buttons and see whether we're getting any issues like code issues. What it means, or our code is good enough or not. How we can test this? We'll write a test methods, and in test methods we'll call the actual Apex classes or methods, and we'll see whether we are getting a expected output or not. Suppose if your method having some return types, or your trigger you're performing some logic, or that some or that logic is getting executed or not. All this we will compare. First of all, we'll call up method and see whether we're getting any exceptions or not. If we're getting exceptions, it will fail the test, or if it's not failing, that's fine. Then are we getting the expected outputs or not? That's what we call the unit testing of the code. So test classes are used to unit test the Apex code. So when we saying unit testing, um, we had to compare the results. We will compare the assets uh, assets are equals and not equals. All we'll check. When you're saying asset assets, assets means compare assets means we'll give some expected value and we'll give an actual value. And if both are equal, then it's called equal assets. If it's not actual, not equals means we give a not expected value and we'll give an actual value. If both are not equal, that's fine. That's kind of equal and not equal assets value. And if we expect some value, but we are not sure about the value, then we'll not do a comparison. Just we do a asset check. That's what the we do. Then why actually we need a test classes? while develop while deploying your any kind of Apex code, while deploying any Apex code to the production, to the production, while deploying any of the Apex code to the production, we need minimum 75 percentage of code coverage. What it means, code coverage is code coverage means, so what we're doing, we're writing test classes, and in the test class we'll be calling the actual classes and methods, right? While we're calling the method, so it will execute line by line, right? So whatever the lines it is getting executed, those lines are called as a coverage. So that when you run your test classes, you need to execute a minimum of 75 lines of 75% of lines without any error. It has to pass the test classes. Minimum 75% of code coverage and no exceptions and no exceptions while deployment. Now, we again after the test classes we need to check some deployment how it looks. In deployments we have concept of a chain sets. In chain sets we call it as a inbound chain sets and outbound chain sets. We'll cover later. Now, so main purpose of the test class is you need to do a unit testing and then you need to compare the results, first part. And second part is if you want to deploy your code to production, you need the 75% of your code coverage and none of the test classes should fail. All test classes should pass and no exceptions or all test classes should pass. Pass means there should not be any failures. Okay. Now, how how we will identify how to identify the Apex class is a test class. We will add annotation at the rate each test. So at the rate each test is used to mark any of the class as a test class. We'll add annotation at that each test at class level and a method level. Okay, so that we'll call the class as a test class and test methods. Then what are all the other consideration while writing a test classes? We do not have access to the database records by default. That means, let's say you have an object called account and you're having some 100 records in your account object. If you try to write, if you're having a class that will query on the account object and display on a Visual Force page, for example, and if you call that method from a test class, it says there is no records found in the account object. By default, we cannot access the database records from a test class. It will not be visible or it will from the test class point of view, the data will not be accessible, which is in a database. So how we can create the test data? So always we have to create the data in the objects and call the different apex. So basically, whatever the data that we create in a test classes, only that data will be accessible throughout the code that is going to be executed from a test class. So let's say you're having a one account controller. You want to write a test class for an account controller. Okay, then you are just created a test class and calling those methods from a test class. And you have some queries in the account controller. So what will happen when you have account controller? So you're writing on some object because you've not created any records in a test class. So there will not be any record present in the object. So it will not return any results. So if you want to get the results, so you have to create a matching data in your test class first. After creating a test data, then only you have to call any of the apex, then only you will get some data. Always you have to create data in a S objects and call the different apex. And okay, so we are creating some data, right? So after running a test classes, do we see the data in actual database? No, we will not see. So whatever the records that are created in test classes will never committed, will never committed to database. Okay, what all we create in we create the data or we create the records in a test class, they are temporary data only used to get the test coverage, and it's purely a test data which will not be committed to a database. So far clear? And then we cannot access the private methods and private variables of the classes. We cannot access the private methods and private variables of the classes. So like a normal Apex class, if you declare any of the variable as a private, what does it mean? You cannot access that variables and methods outside that class, right? So test class is also outside a class, so we cannot access those methods and variables. So if you cannot access, then how you're going to get the coverage for it? So how we'll get a coverage is we can add the we can add annotation at test visible to access the private variables and uh, variables and methods from test class. So let's say you have one class and you have some private variables and methods, and if you want to write test class for it, you are not able to access it. So in that Apex class, what you need to do was before that a private variable or private method, you need to give a annotation called at the rate test visible. Only those are visible when the test class is running. So only we can access from the test class only we can access. Why? Because it's for a testing purpose. So system will understand, okay, even though it's a private variable, make it visible to a test class. Okay, that is one. Next one is we have a concept called a start test and a stop test. So what actually it does first, start test. So if you before we are getting started, um, what will happen? Let's say if you have a future classes or batch classes, schedulable classes. So what actually those means? Those codes are not synchronous apex, they are asynchronous apex, and they will execute only whenever the system resources are available. They will not execute immediately, right? If the classes are not executing immediately, when your test classes will be executed, all are synchronous, right? It will call and see how many lines are covered, then it will give a percentage of coverage. If you having such kind of asynchronous effects, if you're calling from a test classes, you'll not get that number of lines coverage immediately. Then how to run the asynchronous apex test coverages? So we have a code block called test dot start test and a test dot stop test. So if you write, so these are like a kind of a statements. If you write any code between these two lines, those code will be executed as a synchronously. Even though you're calling a asynchronous apex, they will also execute immediately. We can run async asynchronous apex also as a synchronous apex by calling them between the start and stop tests. Okay, so in short, the test dot start test and stop test will convert the asynchronous apex call to a synchronous call, so that you will be getting the coverage immediately. Even though if you're in a batch, so immediately it will complete, and after completing the batch only it will go to the next line. If you're calling a future, after completing the future class only it will go to the next line. That's what changing from asynchronous to synchronous. On top of it, um, when the start test is started, all your governor limits will be reset. That means, let's say if you're having some test class code, so you written some test class, so you're calling some apex and you're creating some records and you're running some SQL queries. So you'll be some consume some, right? Let's say you consume some 50 or 90 or 80 SQL queries you used, and you did some 100 DML operations. You did all this. So by the time you did test dot start test, what will happen was it will reset all the governor limits. So you will be having a fresh set of governor limits when you start a test dot start test. And for if you write a SQL query over here, it will be having a fresh limits. So you can write 100 SQL queries and you can query 50,000 rows. All the option you will be getting in the start test and a stop test. So if somebody asks like, what is the start test and stop test? So you can run asynchronous batch also as a synchronous, sorry, asynchronous apex also as a synchronous apex. You can give examples as a future batch scheduling and everything. You can give an examples of asynchronous. And on top of it, you can reset the governor limits in that block. So again, after stop test, before starting a start test, how many governor limits you used, again you will be having a same value after a stop test. Only this block will have a fresh set of governor limits. But after stop test, again whatever previously you consumed, that will be there. The remaining only you can use outside the stop test. Okay, so far are we clear? Yes, boss. So let's say in your test class, you want to see the already existed data. So initially what I said, you only see the data that you created in test class, that can only you can access. But in some scenarios, you want to see the actual data in your database, not the test data. Not test data means what are the data you created, that will also be there. Along with that, you want to see the actual data that's stored in database also you want to see. Then what you have to do was, you will be having at each test at a class level, there we need to give a see all data equal to true. Then what will happen was, then you are allowed to access the data from a database also is used to access the database data as well while using the while executing the test classes. That's it. Okay, and what else we have? We have one more annotation called test setup. So I will explain this. So is used to create test data for any test class. Ignore about this one. I will explain once we have seen all this, some examples of a test class, then we'll see. Now, I'll just close everything. So Apex classes. So what is this percentage of code coverage? Sorry, it's not a code coverage. This percentage is a for an arc, you have a 6 MB of a limit of for the Apex code. Out of that, you are utilizing a 1.13 percentage of a space that you utilized. Okay, now let's write. Okay, so let's say we'll say some examples. And we'll start with the simple. Let's say I have a account trigger and account trigger handlers I have. Okay, let's write a code for that one. I will opening the account handler trigger class. So in this in the developer console, you have some tabs over here, right? So logs we see and query editor we normally use. And if you see the checkpoints and tests also. So this is the place where we check the what is the test coverage for different classes. See, this is the overall code coverage. Here it will give all the classes and triggers that require a code coverage for you. So you can see how many number of lines there are and what is the percentage of code coverages. So here it's saying you're having some lines and none of them are having a coverage. If you want to write a coverage, how to write a test class first of all. So let's say I have a student info. So I want to write a test class um, to cover this method. What is the what I could say? What should be the naming convention of a test class should be the same class name followed by a test. So I would like to write test class for this one. File new apex class. This one and followed by a test. This is how we write a test class name. And then what we have to do, we have to write a at the rate is test has to be annotated. Then it will be treated as a test class first thing. And then we have to write the test methods which has to start with the at the rate is test, and then it has to be a private static void and your method name. um, I will mention over here test method specifications, or something we call it as. These are static methods. Return type should be void. Preferred as a private methods. Even if you give public also, nothing to worry, but no need to give it as a private. Just a private methods also fine for it. That is test annotated. That's it. That's what the test method specifications are. Okay. So now, so this is the class. Do we have any method here? No, right? You have only the constructors only you have. Still, you need to cover those. I would say you can give whatever the name you want. Nothing need to be any naming convention. Um, test student info constructors. That's it. See, yeah, I want to give a coverage for this one. So how can I give a coverage over here? Just the lines to be executed in this class. So I have this class, and I have all constructors with a different parameters, and inside I have a one more class. Okay, so let's write. Just try to call this constructors. How we can call the constructors? By creating any object, you can call that constructors, right? So first one is a empty constructor, right? So first one is a empty constructor. Next one is a passing a string, and next one is a passing a string, integer, integer, and string. Third constructor, and then we having a one more class inside it called a wrapper class. Let's see how to cover those lines. First, I have a written only empty constructor, and see when we, so here where we will run the test. So once I click the run test, so you will see the log here. Okay, it's a pass, then it will tick mark. If it's failed, then it will give a into mark and give a some exception here. And here you can see how many methods you have. Those will be the number of tests that you're going to have. So I have only one, so it gave only one and zero failures. Now let's go there and see the code coverage for student info. So here also we can see, and there also we can see. So here in the student info you can see 9% of code is covered. So there you can, here also you can see what are all the all code coverage. So you covered only one line of a code, and remaining lines are uncovered. Okay, now I would like to write one more method. Construct empty. This is one test method, and next constructor single variable, and there it is passing some name, that is one. So one is a empty, and second one is a string, and third one is a string, integer, integer, and string. Okay, now let's have a one more method saying four variables, and here first one is a string, and second one is some number, and third one is some more number, and fifth one is some total four variables. First and last are strings and middle two are integers. Okay, and then okay, that's all I have. The methods or constructors I have was so because they all are different methods, so I'm using the same object variable, so not an issue. Now run the test. So all tests are passed, and if I go here and see, now I have this empty constructor passed, single variable passed, and four variables also it executed. Now I'd like to call this class info as well. Okay, so how can I access the inner class from this one? Just you have to create a variable for it. That's it. So test info inner class or wrapper class, whatever you can call it as. So there, student info dot class info, and I need to create a variable for it. Info dot class info. Here also, I'll call it as a class info, and how many variables it's having. Class name and a class teacher. There are two strings. So one is a I would say class, and then followed by a teacher. Okay, that's all I have. So it's just a public only, right? Yeah, then only I can access that the class. Okay, so I write a constructor for the inner class as well and run the test. If you look at, see, all lines being covered now, and I don't have any exception. And if you look at here, the code coverage for that particular class called a student info